Just about 1 week ago, I decided to sit down and read the newest book that was dominating the talk across the news headlines. It's called Fire and Fury. Chances are you've heard about this book. And if you've not heard about it, go to the president's Twitter timeline because he, amongst all other people, has been mentioning and promoting the book, although I don't think that's his exact intention to promote the book. See, it's a reporter named Michael Wolff who was granted access to be inside of the White House during the transition phase. That's the idea, at least, where it began. In fact, there was a report out today that he was going to call, according to what he had told the president, the book The Great Transition. It was not called The Great Transition. Instead, the title was taken from President Trump's famous words at Mar-a-Lago, where he was talking about North Korea making threats to the United States, and he said if they continued making those threats, they would be met with fire and fury. That was his quote, a likely reference to nuclear holocaust. It should be also noted that immediately following those threats, North Korea did issue another threat to Guam. We wanted to go through this book because it's dominating the news cycle. There's talks on both sides, and I want to mention this before we begin. You see, there is a side of people that are discussing this that says this book is completely incredible in the sense of not being a credible source of information. There are people on the opposite side that say everything in this book is the gospel and it should all be taken as such. For the sake of it, I would like to point out, although I don't often share my personal opinions on this, I don't fall on either of those spectrums. In fact, I am more of an interested observer, a student of politics, somebody that wants to know what's going on and wants to find out more. Like most Americans, I recognize that the national news media has beat up on our president, and it's not always in a fair sense, but quite often it is and still is called fake news because the president does not like being challenged. This is verifiable among many reports that have been done on the subject, amongst his cabinet changes, and of course in the book that we're about to talk about. It would be ridiculous to suggest the book is 100% truth or 100% false. Neither make much sense. Somewhere in between is an accurate or somewhat accurate description of events that went on. And I do believe, as according to the author, this is what he perceived. I don't think he was intentionally trying to mislead anyone. And when we go through the book and begin going through that, I think you'll see that too. But I want to urge caution for those of you who are so fed up with negative news on the president that you're ready to lash out. I think this is a good opportunity for you to tune out and turn off the live stream. It's not that we're going to be beating up the president, but we're going to report what is in the book. And we're going to tell you so you can either decide if this author slanted the president unfairly so, to this degree, by the way, or if his words had truth to them to a certain degree. Either way, it's your decision. And we're only reporting the information as according to the book. However, as the book came out, I immediately noticed it was full of news, incredibly newsworthy. Almost every single page had something on it. It seemed like that at some point or another could be valued in a news sense. And so what I did was I began keeping up with the book and its most pertinent information via Twitter. And so you can follow me on Twitter at Stan Morris if you'd like to find out more information and if you'd like to go through the thread that I did, which is 90-something tweets long, and will give you an idea of everything that I perceived as being newsworthy in the book, if you don't want to read it. I want to go ahead and, before I begin this, point out that book reviews like this are being done by almost all outlets that I can imagine. This just came in the other day, yesterday. It's Time Magazine's latest cover. It is a specific, take a look at it. I just want to give you an idea of what it looks like. It's the president with his hair on fire, a reference to Fire and Fury, right? Because he's also yelling, and it's titled Year One. That is the cover for what is a long review of the book. This will be something similarly so, and again, we will approach it from a fair perspective, which is not always complimentary of one side, not always accepting of this man's version of events on the other. But we hope to land somewhere in between that lands us closest to the truth, as that's what we're after here on NEA Report. So, I'm again going to state this one last time here at the beginning, but I'll try to do this throughout the book. The first thing I did mention in the Twitter feed was that all of the statements, all of the book's assertions are according to the author Michael Wolff. That's his assertion. It's not mine. It's not any A reports. And we're just mentioning that because we know there may be some passionate viewers getting ready to reply. And we want you to. We want to know what you think about every single thing that we're about to tell you about this. Discuss it. This is very important stuff. And if nothing else, history in the making. And this is a version of it that was told that the president, remember, did not want this book sold. He tried to have a legal injunction to prevent it from being sold, and it was released on sale early on Friday, as a matter of fact. So it would have been just about a week ago. Roger Ailes ousted at Fox News over vastly inferior sexual harassment claims than the president's, which he withstood a short time later after the fact with the Billy Bush tape. He planned a Trump TV news network, according to the book. In fact, if that sounds crazy, just think back. Remember when the president's Facebook page did news broadcasts for like a short period of time? And they were pretty favorable. I want to say Tommy Lauren was perhaps involved in that. Don't recall exactly, but I do recall a great deal of news about this. And at the time, Roger Ailes was gone from Fox, but he wasn't, in his mind, gone from TV news. He had an idea and he wanted to do more. Trump, by the way, according to the book, bragged on Hillary's campaign while railing on his own. According to the book, he thought his campaign was inept. In fact, he made a statement, and this is a quote in the book, that the thing was so screwed up, we'll say, that he thought there was no chance of winning. Meanwhile, Melania, according to the book, was completely against the idea of winning, it says. It was compared almost to the plot of The Producers, the campaign. If you've seen the movie The Producers, you know it's the idea of setting forth with the goal in mind of not producing a winning Broadway play, but perhaps otherwise a losing one. The idea being that they would lose money but win in otherwise perhaps surreptitious business practices. The idea being that Trump's campaign, at least as alleged at the beginning of the book, was more for the president to launch his own brand and further his own brand, and perhaps including even a brand of news. But it went another way, as we know, and he is now our president. Steve Bannon would be the head of the Tea Party in this sort of idealized world where President Trump would not have won the election. According to the book, Kellyanne Conway would have walked away a cable news star. Reince would have gotten his Republican Party back, Reince Priebus. He was the head of the Republican Party at the time, which had gone from being a traditional conservative movement with people like Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz to this wild, six-shooting, spinning Donald Trump that said, this is how we're going to do things and we're going to do it my way. And he took the Republican Party away. Well, the idea was that they would get the Republican Party back after Trump lost. And then Melania could go back to her inconspicuous life of doing dinner parties and enjoying the private life while, being married to a rich guy. That was the plan. That's what the book says. Roger Ailes was coaching Trump after he won, by the way. Suggested he pick Speaker Boehner, according to the book, as his chief of staff. Who's that? President Trump reportedly asked. He told a, quote, friendly cable anchor that his Billy Bush conversation wasn't really him. The book said that, and this has been reported several times, the book said, quote, I've been told by people who understand this stuff about how easy it is to alter these things and put in voice and completely different people. Evidently, not a joke. At least that's what this account said. Rupert Murdoch allegedly called Donald Trump on the phone, and after a phone conversation between the two, when the president insisted that he had Silicon Valley in his back pocket, the owner of Fox News reportedly called him a blanking idiot. That is what the book asserts. On his inauguration day, President Trump was in a particularly bad mood. The reports were that he believed that the Obamas were very arrogant toward him, toward he and Melania. And that actually makes sense when you think back to some of the photos, especially that have been turned into memes, where Michelle Obama was kind of looking at the Trumps with this look of contempt on her face. It makes sense. He may have felt that. It goes on to say that with a grim face, he gave his inauguration day speech, and George W. Bush, who was there, said, quote, that's some weird S-H-I-T. George W. During the alternative facts interview, if you remember that very notable interview with Kellyanne Conway, what I think was with Meet the Press host Chuck Todd, Kellyanne Conway said alternative facts, and that has probably become one of the biggest phrase words or keywords that has come out of the first year of the Trump administration. She actually meant to say alternative information. Now, for some of you who are wondering what the difference is, well, what she was talking about was inauguration crowd size. That's what alternative facts was about. They were saying that the inauguration crowd was the biggest ever. It wasn't. Factually, it's been measured as such and reported very easily to be seen as such. But she was relying on alternative information is how she was attempting to put it. It sounds a whole lot less bad when you say it that way than she was relying on alternative facts, because that makes it sound like an alternative reality. So, this has been a report we've seen several times too. Steve Bannon learned that the last person who speaks to President Trump before he makes a decision is the person who has the most influence with the decision. This has been reported, as I mentioned, several times before. It's nothing new here. It's kind of a strategy to be the last person to speak in a meeting. Trump's firm belief was that people have had it up to here with foreigners. That's why he's so gung-ho about immigration, according to the book. His firm personal belief is that people are just sick of foreigners. That's what the book says. The travel ban. It was really intended to be a Muslim ban, and we know that. The president, of course, called for a Muslim ban during his campaign until we could, quote, figure out what the hell is going on here, unquote. In his first 30 days in office, he initiated a travel ban. It wreaked havoc on the airports. It was done on a Friday, according to the book, because it would cause the most havoc and upset liberals the most. That was the architecture of Steve Bannon, to launch the travel ban on a Friday, on a weekend when people travel the most, to upset people the most, and to, in essence, affect more people, more of those foreigners that the book claims that people are fed up with. An interesting point to mention, Donald Trump and Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski were close friends at the beginning of all this. They're certainly not now. If you watch Morning Joe on MSNBC, you know that there's probably not a bigger set of critics on television of the president than that program. Well, it didn't begin that way. In fact, it started out with the president inviting them at the beginning of his term. He pressed them to ask how well his first week had gone, with the travel ban having gone in effect. So it was around then Scarborough realized that nobody told him it went poorly, the book says. So he suggested it might have been handled better. That is when President Trump said he should have invited Hannity instead. It's one of the first beginning reports of the president immediately rejecting advice that's not warm to him. There's a report in the book that Jared Kushner leaked information to Joe Scarborough. Leaked it to Morning Joe. See, he's really painted as this quiet, malleable, almost snake-like 36-year-old who knows when to retreat from stepping on Trump's ego, but knows when to swoop in and take an opportunity. Kushner himself actually offered to marry Mika and Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough. The two are kind of a couple, if y'all didn't know. When President Trump heard that idea, he scoffed at it. Why would they want to be married by Jared Kushner when they could be married by Donald Trump, he said at Mar-a-Lago. Jared and Ivanka made a deal that Ivanka, according to the book, would be the first of the two to run for president when the time came. According to the book, their hopes are to make this into a dynasty. Bannon was horrified when that report came out. Kushner's first sort of achievement himself was to bring the Mexican president into the White House after the campaign. He finalized plans to actually come, too, the Mexican president. He was going to do it. And then Trump tweeted about building a wall and Mexico paying for it. The very day after Kushner verified those plans, the Mexican president immediately scrapped the plans, the book said, to show up. A lot of stuff in here to get to, isn't there? It's strongly implied that Ivanka and Jared tolerate Donald Trump's, quote, less than stellar attitude, taking quotes from the book here, folks, out of wisdom as to the consequences otherwise. Rupert Murdoch said, they're not fools. That's his word. Early in the White House, President Trump got into a disagreement with Secret Service because he wanted to install a lock on his bedroom door, the book states. He was so angry because the housekeeper picked his shirt up off the floor. The book said that he told the housekeeper, if I put it on the floor, that's where I want it. That's where I want to pick it up from. Organized mess. We've all been there, right? On February 8th, when Neil Gorsuch took public exception to Trump's disparagement of the courts, this was during the time the travel ban was being challenged in court. And I think the president had made a comment about a certain Latino judge. President Trump had taken it a little bit too far, according to many in the legal world. And Gorsuch was among those, apparently. He took public exception during the hearings with Congress, Gorsuch, during his nomination hearings. The man that's now a Supreme Court justice was apparently not to be for a minute because President Trump heard that and decided to pull his nomination, according to the book. He was going to pull Neil Gorsuch and not nominate him, but it says Bannon and Priebus talked him out of it. But President Trump did not want Neil Gorsuch. The book says he really wanted Rudy Giuliani because Giuliani had been loyal to him. The problem is Giuliani's pro-choice, and a lot of conservatives would not be for that. Bannon is painted as the, quote, deep throat of leakers in this book. And he's said to be one of the biggest leakers. Kushner is also. But it's painted that Donald Trump may be the biggest leaker of all. The reports suggest that President Trump would haplessly make these, quote, seething, self-pitying, and unsolicited calls to people without the presumption of confidentiality. A short time later, details would end up being leaked. The president said that Saturday Night Live is hurting the country by being, quote, very, very mean to him. He called them fake comedy, which is interesting because we've not heard that one yet, at least to my knowledge. Fake news, fake book, now fake comedy. We get to the Russia scenario, and the book begins to outline this with great speculation because, of course, we don't know if there has been some type of connection or collusion between the Russian campaign and President Trump. We do know that there was a meeting in Trump Tower between Russians claiming to have dirt on Hillary Clinton and President Trump's son-in-law, and according to this book, his son, Don Jr. That's what the book says, and we'll be talking about that more soon. But there's a lot of speculation about that. This book speculates pretty openly. It says that the worst-case scenario about the theories connected to the Russia-Trump investigation or the incidents is that Trump is a, quote, Manchurian candidate. That's an exact quote that's used in the book. It shocked me that he used that. Other theories are that he's trying to garner favor with Putin, that Trump and Russia together worked to hack the DNC, that Trump feeds off indirect Russian money, or that he just admires authoritarians. These are all theories as to why the president has a friendly relationship with Russia. Michael Flynn, who's now been charged with a crime, had only one supporter in the president's administration, and that's reportedly President Trump himself. Trump, for a moment, it says, wanted to make Michael Flynn the vice president, according to the book. Flynn won favor, and this is no surprise. If you think about it, you remember those rallies when Michael Flynn was chanting, lock her up, a little bit ironic considering what's happening to him now. Well, that won huge favor with the president. Being a, quote, ranter and raver made the president a huge fan of Michael Flynn. Flynn made mistakes conducting business with Russia because the book says he never thought Trump would be president. In fact, the book actually said that he was apparently either quoted or had inferred that the only way this would be a problem is if, big if, the president were elected. Again, it was not expected that the president was going to win this election. And if you look at the video of President Trump that night, he looks white as a ghost. His victory speech didn't sound like a President Trump victory speech. He said, at least in the book, according to Michael Wolff, that President Trump didn't want to blame Michael Flynn because he believed it would connect him to a plot when there was no plot. Only after aides came up with the excuse that Flynn lied to Pence, who, by the way, Michael Flynn did not report to, did Trump decide to fire Michael Flynn? See, it's argued that Flynn is more powerful or had a more powerful position as national security advisor than the vice president, who, even though he can't be fired by the president, he has no job. He really just exists to take over, and that's it, unless the president gives him more jobs. It's noted at this point, as we're in the beginning of the administration, that all three, Priebus, Bannon, and Kushner, were effectively the same chief of staff. It's also noted that there were some who believed that the president was semi-literate. The report says he could read headlines or articles about himself and gossip squibs on the New York Post, page 6, but some thought he may have been dyslexic. And it says, as an exact quote, certainly his comprehension was limited. That's what Michael Wolff wrote. It's been reported, by the way, that the president does not read headlines or read more than the headlines. He certainly does not read the body of the story. It's been also reported he does not read books. It says he didn't read. It says he did not listen. It says he preferred to be the person talking, that he trusted his own expertise over that of vastly more well-informed sources. That's what the book says. Sometimes people set out to convince him he had come up with ideas others actually had to get him to go along with something, the book said. Most or all of the president's decisions are based on his gut instincts. It says he can't take in any new information, and that's why. According to the book, he hates learning. And this is when Michael Wolff really begins to assert his opinion on the matter from his own observations, at least, through his eyes, on the president's reading or comprehensive abilities. It mentions those on the campaign who admired his work ethic began to worry most after he won during early intelligence briefings. The reason being, he wasn't paying attention during those, apparently. One of Steve Bannon's interesting jobs was to keep track of the promises that the president made. He had to keep track of them on a whiteboard in the White House. Trump couldn't remember making some, but went along with it, maybe indicating that either Trump couldn't remember, as openly stated, or perhaps indicating that Steve Bannon had included a few of his ideas into the whiteboard. In fact, Jared Kushner himself wondered if Steve Bannon made up some of the items that ended up being claimed as being Trump's ideas. The first several times Mick Mulvaney went to the White House, someone had to tell Trump who he was. Trump was little help during the budget process, the book claims. Mitch McConnell said, quote, "This president will sign whatever is put in front of him." And according to the book, Reince Priebus agreed. Steve Bannon thinks Paul Ryan is slow-witted, if not incompetent. Bannon ridiculed him constantly under his breath, the book said. Bannon's talent and unique ability was described as a way to make Trump feel like that Steve Bannon's views were really Donald Trump's views. Bannon is compared to a talk radio host which could be reliably turned on and off at Trump's pleasure. The idea being if Trump wanted Bannon to shut up, he didn't have to work hard to get him to shut up, and Bannon would be obedient. So while speaking at CPAC, Trump went off the rails. And he watched, his aides were being watched by all the reporters, and they all had their best poker faces on, Wolff said. This is when the president was speaking, and at the conservative conference, he had not planned to go off of the rails or off script, so to speak. It said he spoke with a, quote, oblivious and happy nature while the staff held their breath. The president, according to the book, regularly told Kushner to check in with Sheldon Adelson. For those of you who don't know who that is, it's a Las Vegas gambling titan. He believes Sheldon Adelson, who I believe is also Jewish, it makes sense. It wouldn't make sense if he wasn't, to be an authority on the Israeli and Middle East peace talks. Las Vegas gambling casino mogul. Hope Hicks, which is currently the White House communication director, told the president that it had come out that Jeff Sessions had met with the Russians. And Trump's response to that was, so what? That was his quote. Had to be explained to him that Sessions lied during his confirmation hearing when the Attorney General said that he had not had contact with the Russians during the campaign. That's changed, by the way, since then. Some might argue about the word lie. It's either lie, exaggerate, but it's had to be, his entire statements had to be changed almost entirely, completely, since he made it. It's been well documented by now, as we know, from tweets, from the media. President Trump blew up when Jeff Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigation. The president also apparently had a secret leaker in the Department of Justice that was informing him about the ongoing investigation. Maybe he still has that. The president has sources around, and he knows what's going on. A word commonly being used in the Department of Justice about Trump was, quote, treason. This is what Trump's source told the president himself. He also said the DOJ was filled with women who hate Trump. Evidently, that was a thought process inside of the Oval Office. When Sessions recused himself, President Trump wanted to fire him right away, right then. He was done with him. We're about halfway through the book right now, just so everyone knows. And so we'll continue with it here in just a moment. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. We're grateful to have you in as we're doing a bit of a different approach to the news tonight. We're doing a book review based on this newsworthy title, Fire and Fury, inside the Trump White House, the first 9 months or so. Everything in the book, according to the author, Michael Wolff, but with it being on top of the New York Times bestseller list and being the topic for intense discussion and debate ranging from the top of the government down, it's worthy, we thought, for our viewers and readers to know what the book contains. Whether you decide to dismiss it and throw it in the dump, or you decide to take it as being literally true, that is up to you. But nonetheless, we're just here to report what it says. Back with more and other details, including a lot more on the Russia investigation. That's coming up.
If you're a business owner, gaining new customers and retaining them is your top priority and biggest hurdle. Today, 85% of customers search online or look for you on social media. Do you have an effective strategy to reach them? At Ace One, we will customize a digital marketing strategy comprising of social media, web, and video marketing that fits your budget. Our dedicated account managers will work with you to create engaging campaigns, covering all digital media outlets. Ace One, your partner in digital marketing. Contact us today.
Welcome back. Let's go through the second half of the book now. And again, thank you to everybody that's joining us. We appreciate all of you who have a keen interest in journalism and to learning more about the process, as we are really here to find out more. We're not actually here to try to take sides, simply after the truth, which we think is the most interesting part of this search. It's to find the truth and to find out what is the truth. We're laying all of the claims on the table, and we're going from there with it. So as mentioned before, halfway through the book, it was February 2017 when the book claims that Tony Blair visited the White House. The book claims that he specifically visited Jared Kushner and told him that the British may have had the Trump campaign under surveillance with the Russians. Now, the CIA claimed it was not true, that they did not, but that was an interesting claim. Had quite a few people talking about that in the White House. In fact, it actually made the president think that there was a mass-scale plot against him from the British. The report in the book from Michael Wolff said that President Trump believes there's a mass-scale plot against him from the British to intelligence agencies, the courts, the media, the swamp, and more. He's a believer, in other words, that everything is conspiratorial. He never has stopped and considered he might be wrong. When he's in an angry mood, it says his staff will simply agree with everything he says. On March 3rd, President Trump saw Bret Baier, the special report anchor that's on Fox News, and he saw him ask Paul Ryan about the allegations Trump Tower had been surveilled during the campaign. Ryan told Baier he had no idea about that. From that very moment, the next morning at 4:35 a.m. began the tweets, and President Trump accused President Obama of wiretapping him. I want to make that clear. On March 3rd, Paul Ryan said he had no idea about President Trump being wiretapped. The next morning, from that, the president claimed that President Obama had wiretapped him. Where are we at next? Here we go. The White House went into scramble mode after that to find anything to make that accusation make sense. They were peppered with questions during the White House press briefings about it. Why is he accusing the former sitting president of a felony? Because it would be to have wiretaps placed on a United States citizen without some type of warrant. The White House went crazy to find something about this, and they tried to do anything they could to make the insane accusation seem less crazy. They settled on a conspiratorial article from Breitbart News. It was when his inner circle, this was around the time that the book says that his inner circle stopped being mostly game to defend him. The report is that Sean Spicer said, quote, "You can't make this SHIT up." That's an exact quote that the book claimed that Spicer said. Bannon told the president-elect after the election, on a different subject now, that they had the votes to replace Speaker Ryan in the House with Mark Meadows, whose wife campaigned for the president even though the Access Hollywood tape had come out that weekend. She stayed on the campaign trail for him. In fact, one of the few who didn't blink or flinch during that time. Trump loved that. Consequently, did not like it when Paul Ryan come out and said that the president was wrong and he believed that Ryan insulted him and bet against him again and again. So the president was initially for that idea. He was actually somewhat open to it. Paul Ryan saved his job, though, the book says, with movie-level flattery and sucking up to Trump. Bannon wasn't surprised Ryan was able to, this is the exact quote, well, okay, let's paraphrase, BS a BSer. How does that sound? The book said. Not only that, Trump didn't know how to be president and accordingly did not want a headache from Congress as well. And it was something that his aides were able to convince him of, that by letting Paul Ryan stay in the position, that he wouldn't have a headache from Congress. Of course, didn't work out necessarily like that, but that was the idea. Trump didn't care about repealing Obamacare, the book says. That was a little bit of a shocker to me, but he went along with it because he's a Republican and because it is a Republican. It says, in fact, a quote from Roger Ailes, the father of Fox News, quote, "No one in the country or on earth has given less thought to health insurance than Donald." President Trump was advised not to call his version of the health care bill Trump Care. Apparently, though, he did want to brand it as that. He also wanted everyone to be on Medicare and apparently asked during a meeting, famously so, with everyone being silent at this question, why can't Medicare simply cover everyone? Paul Ryan and Tom Price visited Trump in Bedminster, New Jersey for a briefing on repeal and replace. He kept wandering off topic, the book says, and wanted to discuss golf. He was bored by the discussion and made it Price and Ryan's job to handle it. He was very disinterested in health care, the book paints a picture of. Interestingly, Kushner privately suggested he was against repealing Obamacare, and instead Kushner said he wanted it fixed, as the Democrats had suggested. An interesting point as to perhaps why that happened. Jared Kushner's brother runs a health insurance company that's dependent on Obamacare. President Trump declined to fire James Comey in the early days of his administration. He thought about it and said no, and said, quote, "Don't worry, I've got him." He felt he had charmed Comey into being on his side. In fact, he had even given him some awkward level of a hug during one of their meetings. But it was during the healthcare debate that Bannon signaled, Steve Bannon, who is one of the big sources in this book, signaled that the story was about Russia, not about healthcare. And he insisted reporters keep their eye on Kushner during the leaks. And that's been something that Steve Bannon has repeatedly done. He's pointed the finger at Jared Kushner, who was also said to be in that famous Trump Tower meeting with the Russians about Hillary Clinton. And we'll get to that more in a minute, or I would explain the full thing now. But Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner's side, the Bannon and the Jarvanka side, as Wolff explained it, they both began an almost military-like operation of sending leaks out on a conveyor belt. It seemed like each side was leaking about the other side. They used media leaks to actually attack each other. The Kushner and Bannon sides did. Reince Priebus, meanwhile, was just kind of staying neutral and trying not to go down in flames. Bannon wanted an up or down vote on health care, but it was a done deal, Paul Ryan said. That was the exact quote Paul Ryan gave the president, quote, "done deal." It was as many as 20 votes short, though. Bannon wanted to make it about the failure of the Republican leadership at that point. But of course, Trump backed down. Bannon was furious at this point. But Paul Ryan and I think Vice President also, the book said, were able to talk the president down so it didn't look like such a huge loss for Republicans. But that's exactly what Steve Bannon wanted. He wanted it to look like the Republicans had screwed it up, because in his mind they had. When Deputy Chief of Staff Katie Walsh told Jared Kushner she wanted out after the health care failure, he immediately discredited her by leaking that she had been a leaker and pushed her out. That's what the book says. Katie Walsh was the second in command under Reince Priebus. She was kind of in one of there were three factions, if I haven't explained this clearly enough. The Priebus faction, which is just traditional GOP, the Bannon faction, and the Kushner-Ivanka faction. Priebus and Katie Walsh were the top two in their side, which mainly stayed neutral and kind of just trying to keep a semblance of what the Republican Party was before in the current administration. Well, this was seen as an opportunity to push a big part of that out. And when she said she wanted out, the report in the book says that Jared Kushner leaked, again, notice the irony, that she had been a leaker, and that he immediately discredited her and said she had to be pushed out. This was interesting. Trump thinks H.R. McMaster is boring and planned to fire him at one point, he told a friend. The quote is, This is an exact quote that's said to come from President Trump in the book, quote, "That guy bores the shit out of me." The book claims several other things as well. It says that when Syria gassed their own people, Bannon almost convinced Trump not to respond to the attack and instead to maintain isolationism. Isolationism is the type of foreign policy that the United States practiced really prior to World War I, where we basically keep to ourselves and hope nothing bad happens. Again, prior to World War I is why that's said, because look how well that worked out over the next several decades. The president was more annoyed about having to think about the attack, the report said, than about the attack itself. The book, I should say, rather. Bannon had sold him on not responding, but Ivanka changed that. It was Ivanka Trump that, along with H.R. McMaster, worried that President Trump should respond and did all they could to try to make that happen. In fact, I think that it was mentioned around this time in the book that she used pictorials, actually used pictures of the children, the child victims, in that to inspire the president to act. It was said in the book that he responded better to pictures than to words. O'Reilly, Hannity, and Roger Ailes, all three of those names, Fox News synonymous. But imagine if they weren't. Imagine if they were the Trump News Network. That sounds like an absolutely made-up idea, and it was close to reality to the degree that Roger Ailes was calling the president, discussing and planning it, and Roger Ailes reached out to Steve Bannon. The book says that Bannon claimed at one point, because they wanted somehow, for some reason, Bannon to be involved. Maybe it's a Breitbart thing at that point, or a partnership with Breitbart, but unlikely that they would wanted to have give away that much revenue, so probably just some sort of affiliation. Hard to imagine, though, Roger Ailes, O'Reilly, and Hannity all together on a network that's not Fox News. Maybe even further to the right. Kellyanne Conway is reported to roll her eyes and make other expressions at Trump, but she also had this weird on-off switch, which comes on the second she's on air, the book says. As soon as that on-air switch comes on, she could not defend the president any more fiercely. But the book claims when she's not on the air, she rolls her eyes at him and goes along with what everybody else is thinking too. Trump really admires her defend-at-all-cost approach and often calls her as soon as she gets off of the air. In fact, I think I've seen interviews before where the hosts mentioned that her phone was ringing before they had even finished the segment. Conway's shamelessness may have won Donald Trump over, but it cost her with more reasonable people in the White House. In fact, Jared and Ivanka called her nails. That's a quote, by the way. Nails. I presume that meant fingernails. Hope Hicks and Corey Lewandowski reportedly had a romantic affair from time to time, the book alleges. Hicks wondered how she might protect him in the press after he was fired. This is when the book says that President Trump sent her running from the room by saying, quote, "Why?" and, quote, "You're the best piece of tail he'll ever have." Trump wanted his first press secretary to reportedly be Ann Coulter, Laura Ingraham, Maria Bartiromo, or Tucker Carlson. By the way, those people all make way too much money for the position. The position is paid like $120,000 a year. It's not very much. Those are all millionaires. Priebus pushed for one of his deputies, a guy named Sean Spicer. Remember him? He became a celebrity. Spicer had one question before he took the job. Quote, "If I do this, will I ever be able to work again?" That's what the book said. The book, it is alluded to in the book that Trump believes Richard Nixon was framed. It's alluded to. It's not stated outright, but it is strongly suggested that the president believes Trump was framed, and he's obsessed with John Dean, a member of the Nixon administration. Let's talk about the firing of James Comey. President Trump fired Comey at the urging of Jared and Ivanka, and he did it ultra secretly behind Bannon and Priebus's back, the book alleges. Trump wanted to humiliate Comey in front of his family, it's said, and so he chose to fire him while Comey was out at events. I think it was on a Friday that it was announced. The next day, Trump met with Russians and compromised an Israeli intelligence agent on accident, the book claims, or book says. I think that was accurately reported as factual, too, although his staff denied it. It's important to note that Trump enlisted Jeff Sessions and Rod Rosenstein in staging the firing of Comey. He wanted them to come up with a letter as to why he could fire Comey. Give me a letter as to why I fire him. He's bad because he did this, 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 and this. Perfect, you're fired. Trump requested the letter, and then he didn't wait for him to finish it before he fired him. They were literally working on the letters still to give Trump a reason to fire James Comey before the president fired him. It's suggested in the book that with egg on his face, Rod Rosenstein got revenge by appointing Robert Mueller. Think about that for a second. That's not been something we've heard talked about in the news. Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, who is now the only person at the top of the FBI that's not recused from overseeing Robert Mueller. It's said that he appointed, or implied that he appointed Mueller because he was angry that Trump fired Comey without giving him a chance to finish the bogus letter that he had decided to go along with. Interesting theories, interesting theories. It's said Roger Ailes was planning to meet with the man Peter Thiel, who would fund this new conservative news network. It's also said that the 2 days before the meeting, he was set to meet with him. And 2 days before the meeting, that's when Roger Ailes fell and hit his head. He slipped into a coma, and a week later he was dead. The book says that Trump forgot to call Roger Ailes' wife and offer condolences. As a matter of fact, the book also went on to claim that several people were furious about that within the circle. The book says Bannon once pointed at Ivanka Trump in the Oval Office and called her an effing liar in front of Donald Trump. It's just interesting because that's very hard to visualize, but that's what it says. Bannon believes it's absurd that the Trump campaign could have colluded with Russia because the campaign was so disorganized. That's what he thought. That's what Trump thought, too, according to the book. He said it wasn't organized enough to collude with its own state organization, much less one from Russia. Trump bragged about how he can fire Mueller, the book says. This was around the time he was publicly lambasting Jeff Sessions for recusing himself from the special prosecutor's Russian investigation, or just the Russian investigation in general. The White House staff channeled his anger away from Mueller, the book states, almost in a way like that he might turn around and actually go ahead and do it, act on it. Trump's tweets and insults often begin as insult comedy, so to speak. Remember Richard Pryor, the kind of insult somebody to be funny style of humor? Well, that makes sense because Donald Trump is hilarious. I think most people, even that dislike him, would agree with that. The man is very funny. And it says his tweets or his insults often begin as intended that way, as humor. But eventually, it becomes official proclamation. in some sort of weird transition that goes, like he says the joke, everybody laughs, they laugh the third, fourth time. By the fifth time, they're not laughing so much. By the sixth time, he's used to them not laughing and he's claiming it's the truth. This is how it began with low IQ crazy Mika, a tweet that he sent out about Mika Brzezinski, the Morning Joe co-host. The book says often after the backlash, Trump would ask, "What did I say?" seeming to forget his own actions. Bannon is certain that during the campaign, Trump met with Russians. He's certain of it. And this may be the single most important line in the book. He thinks Don Jr. walked a Russian group up to Trump's office. Specifically, he said there's no way that Don Jr. didn't walk them up there to impress his dad. The meeting, of course, it's referencing is the meeting in Trump Tower where Don Jr., along with several others, were said to have met with a group of Russian nationals who claimed to have dirt on Hillary Clinton. Before we get to more about that, Bannon thinks it's insane that Don Jr. met with the Russians in Trump Tower. He thought it was stupid. I mean, he did not make any bones about it. He said, why didn't you go? Let me see. I think I've got the quote here. I do. He wanted to know why they didn't go to a Holiday Inn to meet. He said, why would you bring them into the heart of the campaign? He couldn't believe that the Trump team didn't have any lawyers with them when they met with these Russians. He thought that was reckless. This ended any defense that there was no contact with the Russians, by the way, clearly. It couldn't any more clearly end that defense. There obviously was contact between the Trump campaign and Russians. It doesn't mean there was collusion between them, but the fact that the Trump campaign brought the Russians into Trump Tower about a meeting on Hillary Clinton with the implications being there was dirt to be learned from it. What do you think? It was believed that the Kushner side leaked these details about the meeting to deflect responsibilities away from Kushner and to Don Jr. Yes, family infighting. It's believed, again, Ivanka and Jared leaked the details of that meeting so that it was Don Jr. and not Jared Kushner who looked bad. But remember when Steve Bannon said earlier something about how that people should look at Kushner in relation to the Russians? He mentioned that several times. Ivanka sat in for President Trump at the G20 summit, and you may remember because this became a moment of significant controversy. At the time, the president was on Air Force One coming up with a letter to explain why Don Jr. had met with the Russians during the campaign at Trump Tower. It is said that the President of the United States then ordered everyone in the meeting to deny the Russian meeting was about Hillary Clinton. It was about Hillary Clinton. We know that to be a fact now. One of the reasons Steve Bannon lost his mind, quote, as President Trump said about him, was when they had that Air Force One meeting to write the lie about the Russian meeting. Bannon was not involved, but he screamed at Hope Hicks because he said she needed a lawyer just for being there. And he said a lot worse than that, by the way, too. Bannon went nuts about this because he thought as soon as the president has ordered federal employees to lie, he'd committed a crime. The book goes on to talk about other subjects. It said Trump briefly wanted to replace the military in Afghanistan with private contractors, special forces, and CIA. Steve Bannon's idea. That was a Steve Bannon special, the book says, but the military ridiculed it, and that idea was gone. Bannon said that, Bannon used Breitbart anytime he wanted to get something done, the book alleges. He leaked all the time and really did a number on McMaster for wanting to surge troops in Afghanistan. But Kushner and Dina Powell leaked this info to the New York Times and the Washington Post, which, by the way, just won fake news awards from President Trump. Those two legitimate journalistic organizations, by the way, not Breitbart, ended up defending McMaster in several stories. So President Trump disparaged generals' advice while embracing enlisted people's advice. That's a quote in the book. Disparaging generals' advice and praising the advice of the grunts, or enlisted men. He wanted and argued for the U.S. to make money off of being in Afghanistan. I don't think that's legal. I'm sure somebody will investigate it now that I said that. Anthony Scaramucci is said to, you remember that guy? Anthony Scaramucci won over Trump by saying, according to one report, quote, "I can only hope to realize a small part of your genius as a communicator, but you are my example and model." Mooch was a Jarvanka guy. That might be a surprise to a lot of people, that considering how reckless Steve Bannon seemed to have been and how sometimes not so much Jarvanka seemed to be, Jared and Ivanka, that it would actually be Jared and Ivanka that got this crazy guy Scaramucci involved. But they did for 10 fun days. He was the communications director. The book shifts all over the place because of the conversations that happen and when that they took place. It keeps them in a chronological order. So we're back now to the Mueller case. Steve Bannon thinks Robert Mueller is building a money laundering case against the Trump family. He thinks that's what it's not just mostly about. He thinks that's what the Mueller investigation is all about. Trump, meanwhile, thinks that's not his mandate and that Mueller can only and will only investigate Russian-related stuff. Bannon is terrified of Robert Mueller, terrified of him. He repeatedly is quoted as saying he's never met a Russian, has no Russian ties, just over and over again. He seemed to want to really reiterate that he couldn't have been any further away from those allegations. Bannon said if Trump fires Mueller, quote, "it just brings the impeachment quicker," almost indicating that he believes it's coming anyway. Bannon said Trump, still after Rudy Giuliani and Chris Christie, won't get them because they were on the campaign. As the attorney general, the idea being that he'd fire Jeff Sessions and appoint a new attorney general, and then they could, stop the Russian investigation. Except all his potential candidates worked on his campaign for him, which makes it a conflict of interest. An interesting point, Steve Bannon said they cannot confirm a new attorney general without the new attorney general swearing not to fire Robert Mueller. Bannon thinks because Trump told the Times that his family's finances were off limits, that the family's finances would most certainly be within the scope of the investigation now, if it was not already before. He said that quote, just that quote, guaranteed that would be looked at next by Robert Mueller. Bannon said he's good at coming up with solutions, but he doesn't see a solution to this one. He thinks that one way or the other, Donald Trump is going to be done in by the Mueller investigation. The book quoted him as saying that. The book is quoted by a lot of national outlets as saying, well, he thinks Don Jr. had a treasonous meeting, blah, 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 blah. But they've missed one of the biggest quotes in the book. Steve Bannon thinks that Donald Trump will not make it through the Robert Mueller investigation. Steve Bannon, the chief architect, the chief strategist, equal to the chief of staff in the White House. And that's what he thinks. We talked about Anthony Scaramucci being appointed. As soon as he was appointed and Donald Trump told everyone, Sean Spicer walked out of the room, went to his office, and wrote his resignation and handed it in. The book says Spicer resigned specifically over the Scaramucci appointment and handed it to the president just moments after he found out. Trump received 4 different options as related to the military's transgender policy. It was all in a discussion or part of an ongoing discussion that was to take place. What should we do going forward? It's said that these different military options, 4 different ones, were presented to frame an ongoing discussion. So 10 minutes later, President Trump tweeted that he was banning transgender people from joining the military. That's what the book says. Reince Priebus and the president. They discussed Reince Priebus's departure. Reince Priebus was ready to get out about this time. You can probably imagine why, based on how many others were departing on in his faction or so, if you will. Well, Reince Priebus discussed his departure, and the book says the president told him, take whatever time you need, whatever works for you, Reince. Take all the time you need. Reince Priebus was just a few minutes later on the tarmac at the airport, and he got an alert on his phone that Trump had tweeted Reince was out and John Kelly was his new chief of staff. Moments after telling Reince, take all the time you need, the president fired him in a tweet. Rex Tillerson called the president a, quote, effing moron. But that's not the only quote that's listed as President Trump's cabinet members disparaging him and his intelligence. By the way, Rex Tillerson's never denied saying that in reports. Never once denied it. The president was furious when he found out about that. But others had names for him too. Gary Cohn called him dumb as shit. Steve Mnuchin in Reince Priebus called him a, quote, idiot. H.R. McMaster said he was a, quote, dope, and more. It's said that there is a universal sentiment of preventing something terrible from happening from this man while he's the president. Can you imagine that? There's even discussion that there's a secret pact in the White House that the president can never launch a military attack without Defense Secretary Maddox and General John Kelly both agreeing first that it happened, although the Trump wouldn't know about that. And that's not verified. But it is indicated that there is a secret pact between those two military leaders. Here's an interesting point. Charles Harder, a name that you probably have never heard or don't recognize, represented Hulk Hogan against Gawker. He now represents Jared Kushner over Russia. Just interesting to point out. Steve Bannon estimated there was a 33% chance, a 1/3 equal chance for each of these three scenarios to happen. Here's what they are. The first is that Trump resigns before the end of his first term. The second is Trump is impeached because of Mueller. The third, only a 1/3 chance of this happening, according to Steve Bannon, Trump limps to the finish line of his first term. Steve Bannon, again, chief strategist, that's what he says there's no second term. There is no way the president will go for a second term if he even runs for it, and it strongly suggests he wouldn't have a chance. Poll numbers kind of indicate that, although who believes poll numbers anymore, right? But still, that's what the book says Steve Bannon claims, that he believes there's only a 1/3 chance that the president even makes it to the end of his first term, 0 chance he has a second term. This is real. Steve Bannon told people he was going to run for president in 2020. And he meant it. He claimed he had backing from the Mercers, which were the family that backed him into having his position at Breitbart. They've since disavowed him since this book has come out. Peter Thiel, who we don't know what his relationship is with him, or Sheldon Adelson, the Las Vegas guy that's got way too much influence in the Middle East process. Finally, as we reach the end here of the book, Bannon plans to continue pushing forth crazy fringe candidates as a result of Trump's election. That's where the book ends. Bannon believes that Trump's election is only the beginning, and that because of this, it's only a matter of time before he can push many more candidates through, and that Trumpism will no longer even need Trump. That's what Steve Bannon claimed, or the book claims that Steve Bannon claimed. If you would like to read more about this, because it is very detailed and in length, or if you missed some of this, I would invite you to go to my Twitter account, twitter.com/Stan Morris. I pinned the tweet there where you can go through all of the, 90-something tweets that we named off there, and see the main bullet points of the book. But to be quite honest, I highly suggest you read the book. It's one of the best political reads I've ever experienced, and I do love reading about politics and about history specifically. It's very hard for an author, as I've researched on this more, to do a book on a sitting U.S. president, because if the author challenges or critiques the president, inevitably he's going to be attacked with his credibility being drawn into question. The credibility is a question for you, the audience. I'm not assigning my credibility to the book, nor do I adopt any of the statements or claim that any of them occurred. I'm claiming that the book claimed they occurred and making that very specific distinction. Regardless of what you believe, it's an important discussion to have, and it's important to know that this accredited reporter, despite what you may believe of him now, he has been accredited in the past, and a journalist with this access came to these conclusions. It's important to note that going forward, despite where this discussion may end up taking us. That's what we've got for tonight on NEA Report. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate you so very much for joining the newscast, and we're back tomorrow at 4 p.m. with more news from Northeast Arkansas, and no more news from the Beltway. Hope you have a great evening, everyone.